Muito boa tarde e muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. I will be walking you all through the housekeeping rules in a few, but for now, would you please keep your videos and microphones turned off and muted while the event is going on? Thank you so much. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third of 3 installments in the joint ICTD ATAF webinar series on property taxation in Africa. My name is... Kindly, sorry, everyone, can you keep your microphones and videos turned off? My name is Sukena Remal. I am a Research and Communications Associate at the ICTD, based at the University of Toronto. I will be your host and timekeeper today. The first webinar of this series explored innovative approaches to property valuation with case studies from Freetown and Dakar. On the second webinar, we switched gears to discuss the political and technical dynamics underpinning the use of information technologies for property taxation in Africa. And for today, we will be discussing a widely underexplored theme in property taxation, which is intergovernmental collaboration for effective property taxation, drawing on examples from Tanzania, Kenya, Ghana, and Angola. We have a stellar panel of presenters lined up, but before I introduce them, I would like to run through some housekeeping rules. We have made provisions for interpretation in 3 languages: English, French, and Portuguese. You may select your preferred language by clicking on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You are kindly asked to keep your videos and microphones turned off and muted while the presentations are ongoing to avoid interference and background noise during the presentations. You may type your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If possible, please indicate to which presenter you would like to ask your question. Everyone, please keep your mics and cameras off. This webinar will be recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, you can leave the Zoom meeting and follow the discussion on the YouTube live stream, which you can find on ICTD's YouTube channel.
ICTD.
We can also, one of my colleagues will also paste the YouTube link on the chat.
I'm from Ivory Coast. Do you know?
Please, Mr. Kofi, we would like you to mute your microphone, and everyone else in the audience, please avoid interfering when either the speakers or the moderator are speaking. Thank you very much for your collaboration.
Again, we would like to thank you all for joining us today from different countries and different sectors, ranging from tax authorities to research and civil society. We would like to acknowledge today the presence of Mrs. Lourdes Banze, Domestic Tax General Director at the Mozambique Revenue Authority. And we also have in attendance today the Honorable Dr. Mamadou Danda, former Prime Minister of Niger and expert on decentralization reforms. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you with us. I will now go on with presenting to you our presenters. We have a set of experts who will be discussing this topic today. Next slide, please. Our first presenter today is Helge Fieldstedt, who is a research professor and economist at the University of Pretoria and the CMI Institute. He will be presenting a case study on Tanzania. Next on will be Faria Mohiuddin, Senior Tax Officer at the International Budget Partnership, and Frank Ohemeng, Lecturer at the Department of Political Science at Concordia University. They will be presenting a case study on Ghana. Following Frank and Faria, we have with us Carla Almeida, General Tax Administrator from the Ministry of Finance of Angola, who will be presenting the experience of intergovernmental collaboration in Angola. And our final presenter will be Monica Obongo, Deputy Director for Land Valuation at the Ministry of Land and Physical Planning in Kenya. Monica will be discussing a case study on Kenya. These presentations will then be followed by a Q&A session, which will last 15 to 20 minutes, during which you are kindly asked to enter, enter your questions on the chat box. Don't forget to indicate which presenter you'd like to ask your question. We will close this webinar with webinar outcomes presented by my colleague from ATAF, Frank Kalizinje, program specialist at ATAF. But before we start, I would like to invite my colleague and APTI program lead, Colette Nyarakamana, for a 10-minute presentation of the topic of the discussion today. Before I hand out the mic to Colette, I would like to acknowledge the work of our team in the background. On the ICTD side, Ollie, Rhiannon, Moyo, and Diana, and on the ATAF side, Frank, Jane, Christine, and all of ATAF's comms team. We would also like to thank our wonderful team of interpreters who are enabling a wide reach of audience today through their work. Thank you so much. Over to you, Colette.
Thank you very much, Sukaina, for these introductory remarks. My presentation will highlight the broad aspects of intergovernmental collaboration and coordination in property tax administration. It is important to note that the nature of this collaboration varies to some extent from property tax is a unique tax in that its administration is rooted in institutional arrangement, requiring collaboration and coordination, both in centralized systems where the tax is collected by the central government and in decentralized systems where local governments collect property taxes. And the allocation of roles significantly varies across countries, and different allocations create distinct technical, political, and administrative dynamics that have a significant effect on the effectiveness of collaboration. And with reference to the property tax cycle that is illustrated in the chart below, collaboration is key in the initial cycles of the property tax administration process. For instance, property identification often requires coordination in data sharing between different agencies in charge, for instance, of issuing land titles, maintaining property records, and those in charge of property valuation. On the other hand, in some cases or countries, valuation is solely a central government responsibility, whereas in other cases, it's almost entirely localized, other than very broad policy guidelines for valuing properties or setting rates. In other countries, valuation can be a shared responsibility between local and central governments, or completely administered locally with specific guidelines from the central government on setting rates, or let's say the frequency at which valuation must be carried out. Therefore, valuation is premised on interagency or intergovernmental collaboration to be carried out effectively. And effective collaboration is especially needed and also challenging in decentralized systems where the property tax administration process is a shared responsibility between central and local governments, and where valuation mainly is the central government responsibility. What can explain the variation in property tax administration across countries? First, one of the main factors are probably historical legacies and path dependence. In fact, colonial systems tended to create relatively complex formal systems premised on the authority of central governments in land registration, maintenance of cadastral registers, and property valuation. And the wave of decentralization reforms that took place in the 90s, although having transferred property tax revenues to local governments, did not dismantle the institutional arrangements that reinforce the control of central governments over specific responsibilities in the property tax cycle. Given the central government expertise in broad property tax policy areas and the need for local governments to tap into the property tax potential to strengthen local fiscal autonomy, there is a legitimate debate with regard to the appropriate balance of responsibilities between local and central governments. The advocates of more centralization argue that maintaining property taxation as a central government responsibility, given its long experience in broad property taxation policies, and the likelihood of having more highly trained valuers, create more consistency in the process while avoiding collusion and poor administration at the local level. On the other hand, the advocates of more decentralization of property tax administration argue that centralization can be overly costly, slow-moving, and inflexible, in part because central governments have weak incentives and weak local knowledge. They instead argue for simplified local approaches to give more powers and control to local governments. So if collaboration is essential for effective property tax administration, the question is, why is collaboration so often difficult or even problematic? Several factors can explain these challenges. First, the legal frameworks governing the administration of property taxes are often ambiguous and opaque with regards to the specific guidelines for collaboration and coordination. On the other hand, the plethora of rules and frameworks governing the property tax administration process, for instance, the Rating Act, in addition to the Local Government Act, the Local Public Financial Management or Finance Acts, may give specific rules and guidelines for handling particular property tax aspects, but may also often or are often less clear about the conditions under which different agencies or levels of governments must coordinate their actions to achieve specific outcomes. Second, there is a misalignment of incentives for collaboration, mostly stemming from the lack of motivation of central governments to accelerate specific processes in their field of responsibility, because property tax revenues do not accrue to them. Also, central governments may have different priorities, such as maintaining an effective land titling system or a reliable cadastral plan to regulate the property tax market and not for property taxation purposes. Third, the costs and resources are divergent, especially when it comes to property valuation. Valuation depends on professional valuers and is very expensive. And most of the time, local governments are unable to meet these costs because of their limited financial capacity or resources. And finally, collaboration and coordination are sensitive to politics or political conflicts. And effective collaboration is often conditioned by the political affinity between levels of governments. And several cases show that, for instance, if a political party in power at the national level is the same as a political party in power in a given local jurisdiction, collaboration is likely to be effective. However, when there is a difference, when the political parties in power at the national level differs from the political party in power at the local level, in this case, collaborative efforts are often undermined or simply blocked due to political competition. In light of these challenges, how to revitalize intergovernmental relationships and collaboration? Solutions need to be thought around the following questions. First, when formal rules underlining the conditions for collaboration are not working, how to reform those rules and find ways to make collaboration work? Second, in situations where the rules are clear, but collaboration strenuous, what informal mechanisms based on mutual trust can help revitalize intergovernmental collaboration? Third, how to create incentives that promote coordination and collaboration among agencies or levels of governments? Fourth, how to align the incentives of those agencies with the needs of local revenue collection? And lastly, what strategies can make intergovernmental collaboration resistant to politics? So today's presentations will explore the challenges and practical solutions to foster better intergovernmental relationships and collaboration, drawing, as Sukaina mentioned, on the cases of Tanzania, Kenya, Ghana, and Angola. Over to you, Sukaina.
Thank you very much, Colette, for this very insightful explanation. We will now move to our first presentation. Over to you, Adelgi. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yes, the administration of property taxes in Tanzania has seen major changes in the last decade, oscillating between decentralized and centralized regimes. So I will go through each of these phases and how the intergovernmental relations spelled out during each of them. If anyone should be interested in more detail on the story of property tax reforms in Tanzania, you are very welcome to consult some of my publications on this. Before 2008, property taxes were administered and collected by the municipalities. Then in 2008, it was the collection of property taxes was centralized to the Tanzania Revenue Authority, which then started to collect property tax on behalf of the municipalities. But the property registers, valuation rolls, and so on were still under the municipalities. Then in 2014, the government decided to re-decentralize property tax administration. So all aspects of the property tax regime were returned to the municipalities. Then 2016, just after 2 years after the decentralized period, it was again centralized, and TRA, the Tanzania Revenue Authority, was mandated to administrate property taxes all over the country, all aspects of property taxes. And then now in June, very exciting, in the budget speech, the Minister of Finance proposed a new property tax regime that it should be collected by the national electricity supplier, TANESCO. Next slide. Yes, this graph provides a snapshot of collection in the three Dar es Salaam municipalities over the period from 2006 to 2017 onwards. I think for you watching this slide, you can focus on the yellow, the upper line here, and on the left side is revenues in million Tanzania shilling. So before 2008. It was fully decentralized, the property tax regime, and the revenue performance, as you can see, was quite poor. Property taxes accounted for about 10 to 30% of revenues on average by urban council, collected by urban council, which is equivalent to less than 0.3% of GDP. And it was estimated in some studies that more than 60% of the revenue potential remained uncollected or was embezzled. This was due to poor administrative capacity, massive corruption, political interventions in collection process, and so on. So in a debate in the parliament in the Doma in 2007, it was this issues was discussed, and it was raised as a concern by members of parliament, and the Minister of Finance, the Prime Minister was responsible for the local government at that time. He announced that property tax should from 2008 onwards be collected by the National Tax Administration. And as you can see from the yellow line again, it was not very impressive improvements in revenue collection when TRA took over. In this phase, TRA was only responsible for collection and then had to remit the revenues collected to the municipalities, while the municipalities, they remained in control of the property registers, the exemptions, setting rates, etc. It was during the last year of the centralized period, 2013-14, then you see an increase in collection by the Tanzania Revenue Authority. But then the government decided to decentralize in 2014, and during those 2 years when the municipalities were responsible, again from 2014 to 16, you can see from the yellow line that it was a substantial increase in revenue collection. Thereafter, the municipalities was taken by surprise in 2016 when the government announced that property taxation should be centralized fully to the Tanzania Revenue Authority. And if I could show you the data now, you would see that there has been a massive drop in property tax collection after 2016. Next slide, please. The centralization of property tax collection in 2008 was seen by the municipalities and some donors as an attempt to halt the decentralization reform that started in 2000. And this contributed to distrust between the municipalities and TRA. And the lack of trust negatively affected both the design and the implementation of the reform under TRA. And the municipalities, they did not provide data to TRA. They were really dragging their feet. They felt that they had not been consulted when the decision to centralize collection was taking place. There are also a number of other issues which was in effect here. Next slide, please. Briefly summarizing some of the experiences during this centralized period. Well, factors that affected the outcome during this centralized period, 2008 to 14, including, of course, politics, which Colette mentioned. It was firstly a very top-down driven directive without consultations, neither with the municipalities nor the Tanzania Revenue Authority. And TRA had poor incentives and poor capacity to administrate and collect the taxes. They did not get any additional resources to administrate and collect property taxes. They had to use already already available resources for that. When it comes to the technical issues, there were also very poor preparation and implementation. TRA, they believed when they took over that they just would receive fully completed, updated property register evaluation roll from the municipalities, which was not the case. And what TRA did was to introduce payment via bank deposits. TRA does not accept cash payment. And of course, that also led to some challenges because the vested interest at the municipal level, they preferred cash, of course. But later on, we see that this introduction of bank payment via banks was also taken forward in later by the municipalities. Next slide, please. So in 2014, the government announced that property tax collection should be returned to the municipalities. And this occurred after massive lobbying by the municipalities, but without consultations with Tanzania Revenue Authority. And the decision took TRA by surprise. What happened during these 2 years, 2014 to 16, under the decentralized phase, there was a major increase, as I showed you in the graph, in property tax collection. The municipalities, they imposed mass evaluation of properties, and they also continued the TRA, the bank payment system, which TRA had introduced previously. And the municipalities also introduced mobile phone-based payment system to simplify payment by property owners. And they also used street leaders to notify property owners when they should pay, and they also collected the tax. And then they had an incentivized system where the street leaders got a small honorarium for contributing for their work here. Next slide, please. So in interviews, municipal staff expressed that they strongly believe that collection of the property tax by the municipality would be far better than that of TRA. And also, if you look at the revenue collection achievement, it improved during those 2 years, 2014 to 16. Next slide, please. But TRA strongly believed that the municipalities had sabotaged the collection of property tax when TRA was in charge. Next slide. But this is not the end of the story, because of in spite of substantial increases in collection by the municipalities during the period 2014, the government announced in June 2016 that the administration and collection of property tax should, in the whole country, should be transferred to TRA. Next slide. And this decision was made in spite of the major challenges TRA experienced in the previous centralized period, and in spite of the poor communication and intergovernmental relations between the municipalities and the TRA, which had been exposed during that previous centralized period. The return of the property tax administration to the TRA took also the municipalities by surprise. They had not been consulted in beforehand. So they questioned the rationale for the government's decision. They argued that the re-centralization of the property tax was based neither on an assessment of what the municipalities had achieved with respect to revenue enhancement in the period 2014 to 2016, nor on an assessment with the problems that TRA experienced in the previous centralized period. Next slide, please. So in as mentioned, 2016, the TRA had taken over the full administration of the property tax regime all over the country. Still, they had not solved the challenges with the communication, dialogue, exchange of information, data with the municipalities, who actually dragged their feet and did not support. So next slide. So some lessons. Well, firstly, it is obvious that TRA has been a catalyst for improvements in collection methods at the local level by introducing new digital payment methods. And TRA has also contributed to reduce the degree to which the local elites are able to evade property taxes. But in contrast to the municipalities, TRA has limited knowledge about the property tax base. TRA relied on information collected at the local government level, which they did not receive. And the municipalities, they had limited incentives to collaborate and share data with TRA. Inadequate statistical information on the property tax base remained a severe constraint for TRA. And also the lack of intergovernmental consultations before and during implementation of the reform contributed to distrust between the involved agencies. TRA had limited capacity to take over the property tax regime in the whole country, and it was also provided with limited additional resources to build capacity. Therefore, one saw a major drop in revenues collected by TRA after 2016. And then the last slide, please. So lessons we can draw from these experiences. Firstly, to make property collection work requires cooperation and exchange of information and proper coordination between the national level and the municipalities. Clarity on the division of functions and responsibility of the central and subnational administration is critical. And the National Revenue Administration and the municipalities must both be provided with incentives to cooperate. It's also important to assess how and to what extent politicians and officials at both central and subnational levels will support the tax reform. So Tanzania is now, you can move to the last slide now, where, next slide. Yeah, that's the final, and now this is a citation from the Minister of Finance, who said it was a mistake to hand over the collection of property tax to the Tanzania Revenue. Maybe it was a mistake, but at the same time, neither TRA nor the municipality were given the tools and mechanisms and guidelines of how they could interact together, how they can cooperate. There were no consultative processes and so on. So it will be very exciting now to see what will happen next in Tanzania. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Delegate. Right on time. Thank you very much for this thorough overview of intergovernmental relations and property taxes in Tanzania. Before we move on to the next presentation by Faria and Frank, a kind reminder to our attendees, you may type your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If possible, indicate which presenter or discussants you should be answering your question. Thank you very much. Over to you, Faria.
Hi, thank you, Sukena, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Frank and I will present on this enigma of the relationship between central and local governments and its impact on property tax administration with the case study of Ghana. So next slide. The way we'll do this presentation is I will talk about the background and context. Frank will present our findings and the policy recommendations that come from it. And then I will talk about the recent developments in Ghana and what this means for what we found and what could be future avenues of work. Next slide. Thank you. And so in Ghana, what we see is all the things that Colette very kindly outlined in her presentation: ambiguous rules and institutional frameworks, misalignment of incentives for collaboration, divergent costs and resources, and political conflicts. And, so when we found these, our key questions were, what does this mean for the relationship between the central and local government? What challenges does this relationship pose for property tax administration? And of course, then what then becomes the appropriate role of the central government in supporting the effective administration of property tax by local government? And with that, I'll now hand over to Frank to talk about what it is that we found when we delved into these questions. Frank, over to you.
Okay, Thank you very much. My apologies. My internet is a little bit unstable, so please bear with me. And if you can't hear anything, we'll try to answer your questions, and Farah will be willing to also answer more. So we found a number of interesting institutional problems that is associated with property tax administration in Ghana. Now, the first point, I believe, is what Ode has talked about even in Tanzania. I mean, the collaboration between central and local government is not really there. And due to the institutional framework that set up this, what we call the central local government relationship. And now, what the institution manifests itself in terms of central government having most of the institutions. So, for example, property valuation, land title, administration, all are centralized institutions. Now, there is a disconnection then between these institutions and the local government simply because of what has been set up in the decentralization document, the institutional framework that comes from the decentralization system. And so you realize that that relationship between decentralized institutions, especially district assemblies and the central government institutions, are not well connected. So it's very interesting that this is part of the problem that we have. Then we also realize that because of this institutional framework, there's a high politicization of local government institutions. So for example, none of the local government employees, belongs to the local government. They are all central government employees. Now, if you look at Ghana's decentralization system, about 30% of the assembly members are even appointed by the government. There's no election of mayors. Mayors are appointed by government. They can be fired anytime. And so government has a role.
Sorry, Frank, we've received a note from the interpreters to slow down slightly so that they can interpret better.
Okay.
Apologies.
Oh, all right. Sorry. Yeah. So what we're saying is that there's a high politicization of the district assemblies in the sense that government appoints mayors. Now, the mayors can be fired anytime. And as a result of politics, government is also able to tell the mayors what they should be able to charge in terms of property administration. Now, when we take the financial part of it, for example, normally every municipality should be able to look at its development and charge certain properties rates that are suitable to that environment. But that is not the case in Ghana. The central government decides that they will give some amount of money funding to the assemblies or the local government. Now, then the local government has to collect other taxes. So when they add what they call the internally generated funds versus what is coming from the central government, the balance, what is left, then becomes what they can charge as property rates to cover up. So let's take, for example, you need $100 million. Your other taxes will give you, let's say, 50 million. The government will then give you, let's say, 20 million. So your shortfall is 30 million. Now your 30 million is what you can charge as property rates. In other words, these institutions have no power to be able to determine the rate that they should charge. So we have highly developed areas as well as also poorly developed areas where the highly developed areas can be simply out of government, but because they are not allowed to charge what they can charge, they have to continue to depend on government, and the government then is able to them what they can charge. The next important point as we talk about institutions is what we call institutional fragmentation. Now, I think Farah talked about it earlier. You have valuation, you have other institutions all involved in property tax. The interesting thing is that they do not talk. So the valuation board, for example, may not know what maybe, for example, the Assembly Common Fund or there's two lands, for example, is talking about. And then you have the Ministry of Finance versus the Ministry of Local Government versus the Office of the Head of Local Government Services, which seems to be an autonomous institution. And these institutions are not talking. And so the assemblies or the local governments are left in a limbo. Whom should we go when we have a problem? And they kind of also receive different directives from these institutions, from finance, from local government services, and from local government ministry. So who should they follow? This is a serious issue that has brought up.
Frank, I'm really sorry. Could you please slow down a bit as we have interpreters translating to French and Portuguese? Thank you so much.
Okay, sorry, I'm looking at the time. That's why. So what I was explaining, is that we have this institutional fragmentation in the sense that all the institutions that our central governments do not talk to each other. What then is happening is that you can have a directive, for example, from the Ministry of Finance. That directive may contradict what the Ministry of Local Government has also said, or what the local government services, another central agency, has said. So there's that fragmentation or lack of coordination, if I have to use that word. Now, not only are these big institutions, but when it comes to, for example, land evaluation, there is no also coordination between land evaluation, two lands that are also part of what the lands that they manage in these areas, as well as other petty institutions that can all talk. So what is happening is that there is also not data sharing. Therefore, if valuation board, that's for example the valuation, the Ministry of Finance has no knowledge, the information they have collected. The Ministry of Local Government has no knowledge. The local government service has no knowledge. And sometimes the assemblies themselves have no knowledge, because under the law, the assemblies have to pay for their own evaluation. And the valuation board can withhold the data that these assemblies or local governments are supposed to use in collecting data, for example. Then what we also found, I hope I've slowed down enough. What we also found is that this institutional fragmentation, as well as the important role of central government, is having significant financial and human capacity problems for the local government. Now, as I explained earlier, in Ghana, local government mayors are not elected, they are appointed. Therefore, the president can get up and fire a mayor today after appointing him or her only yesterday. So there is that problem in which that instability creates a situation where the assemblies or the local governments are not able to have some kind of a long-term planning, because the mayor is after his or her political job and must always do what pleases the president. And because assembly workers or local government workers are also central government workers, they can be transferred easily without their knowledge. So once person starts some project, before he finishes, he's transferred. So there is that lack of coordination as a result of this fragmentation, and that is what is affecting property and tax administration in Ghana. Faraya, can you wrap it?
The next slide. Yeah, Frank, please. Or would you like me to present this? Well?
Yeah, present that.
So coming out of this quagmire that we found, our policy recommendations were, changing the institutional foundation of local government administration in Ghana. What do we mean by that is that a lot of the foundational language or legal frameworks are set in the Constitution. And of course, it's no easy thing to say change the Constitution, but if we would have our way, we would say, yes, change the Constitution to grant more power to local governments to be able to control all these processes. As Frank said, a lot of the key processes that are involved in property tax administration, from valuation to rating to what have you, are all really controlled by the center. But if you look at the legal foundations, they're meant to be controlled by the local government. Linked to that is revising other institutional frameworks governing local government. So what that means also is that there are a few policy documents that are supposed to lay out how all these sections of government are supposed to work together, but they are really threadbare and don't solve a big problem, which is no ministry agency has the mandate to actually control this whole process, to have oversight over this whole process. Technically, though, that should be the local government. This issue of valuation being centralized and the ability of land valuation to withhold data because the assembly or the local government is unable to pay them for the service what our recommendation from that is that should become privatized, or at least should not be within the stranglehold of the land valuation department, and that they should become a regulator rather than the direct service provider. And of course, underpinning all of this is that, yes, property tax is meant to be a local government tax, but in the way that it is set out, local governments have very little autonomy to administer this tax. So that's where we came out of it with, came out of this research project with these recommendations. And then since then, there have been some recent developments. Next slide. Yes, so we'd say we've had one bad, one good. So this is the bad. So our policy recommendation was granting significant autonomy to the assemblies in property tax administration. But rather in 2016, the Local Governance Act of 936 essentially centralizes the setting of property rates compared to the earlier Local Government Act. So now it is the Minister of Finance who can set property rates, which is linked to, de facto what was happening, which is that local governments were told, you have this gap, use property tax to fill it, now that has been put into law, essentially. However, next slide. One good development is that there have been efforts to do private valuation and simplified mass valuation efforts through digital platforms like apps that can easily do valuation by taking photos, creating one simple online database for all these things. However, it's interesting to see what has pushed that in Ghana. So it seems that this has happened because of massive donor pressure. Both VNG, which is a private consultancy that works with the Dutch government, and GIZ, the German aid agency, have undertaking these massive property tax pilots. And in order to get around land valuation division, they have worked with the Ministry of Finance and with the assemblies themselves to create temporary valuations, which are technically not legal, but however, they're using it to push it forward. And this also has led land valuation division itself to think about ways of piloting digital tax, digital property valuation through apps. However, on paper and in the legal frameworks, these valuations are illegal. So it's very interesting to see how that will get resolved. And with that, we finish our presentation. Apologies for going over time. Thank you, Sukena, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Feria and Frank, for this explanation of the challenges of intergovernmental collaboration and decentralization in Ghana, and for closing on such insightful policy recommendations. Now we are off to Angola. Over to you, Carla. Thank you very much.
Perfeitamente, Sukenia. Muito boa tarde a todos. Nós vamos hoje aqui apresentar a experiência de Angola no que diz respeito a esta problemática da inter-relação governamental para permitir uma ótima tributação do imposto predial. Nós vamos fazer uma breve introdução, depois passaremos a contar também de forma muito breve a situação da reforma da tributação do património em Angola, que ainda está em curso. Vamos apresentar alguns dados sobre a propriedade. Vamos também falar de algumas medidas que o próprio Executivo está tanto a ajuizar, sendo que a Administração Geral Tributária é o órgão que está vocacionado para operacionalizar, para desenvolver, para consolidar esta política fiscal. E depois faremos breves conclusões. Próximo slide, por favor. Pronto, como se disse, o continente africano ainda enfrenta o resquício do sistema colonial, e vemos isso em parte das nossas legislações, e isso também não foi diferente para a legislação ligada ao património. No caso de Angola, nós tivemos uma lei fiscal, portanto, relacionada ao património, nosso código de imposto, que na altura era predial urbano, porque somente tributava os prédios urbanos. Esta legislação teve uma vigência de 50 anos, quer dizer que durou, portanto, um pouco mais do que era necessário, e isso foi sentido porque o instrumento colonial passou a ficar desajustado ao longo do tempo para a nova república que se constituía. Começamos a ter algum problema relacionado com a omissão do cadastro da propriedade, que se foi desatualizando com o tempo, seja pelo facto do próprio governo independente, Angola independente, ter privatizado, ou ter chamado assim, confiscado, na verdade, todo o património colonial, mas não houve depois oportunidade para que se fizessem registros. E à medida que o Estado foi vendendo esta propriedade aos particulares, havia também essa problemática do registro desse trânsito imobiliário. E isto fez com que quem estivesse na matriz já não fosse, de facto, o sujeito, aquela pessoa que deveria ser tributada. Enfrentamos problemas também no ponto de vista do sistema de avaliação, porque o sistema de avaliação colonial era, portanto, com uma intervenção de entidades privadas que faziam avaliação. Essas entidades também se extinguiram, não é? E, por conseguinte, não havia objetividade, portanto, não havia como objetivar no período pós-independência este sistema de avaliação conforme estava concebido no instrumento que era antigo, que era o código, que ainda vigorava. Isso fez com que, do período de 1975, tanto que foi constituída a nossa independência, até 2011, aproximadamente, inícios de 2011, não houvesse quase tributação do património em Angola. Foi fruto de uma reforma que iniciou em 2011, que tivemos então a possibilidade de mudar, não de revogar o código na totalidade, mas de mudar algumas situações respeitantes, sobretudo, ao sistema de avaliação. Portanto, foi instituído um sistema de avaliação que era meramente fiscal, que não envolvia nenhuma entidade externa, e a avaliação era feita maioritariamente, portanto, com um pendor declarativo, que eram as pessoas que declaravam portanto, como estavam as suas propriedades, as suas dimensões, e por meio deste ato declarativo se fazia uma avaliação objetiva e com um efeito meramente fiscal. Podemos aqui perceber que a situação da deterioração do cadastro a nível nacional, portanto em Angola, que durou de 1975 até 2011, foi, portanto, o que causou, sobretudo, o adormecimento do imposto. E, fruto desta reforma de 2011, as situações começaram a gradualmente alterar-se e vamos ver de que forma. O próximo slide, por favor. Portanto, aqui trazemos os diferentes quadros legais que foram surgindo na sequência da reforma que iniciou em 2011, tivemos uma lei que alterou o código e, mais recentemente, nós tivemos, em 2020, uma revogação total do código que remontava do período colonial e passamos a ter um novo código. Este código novo teve como propósito alargar a base, incluindo também a tributação dos prédios rústicos, pois o anterior diploma só, portanto, estavam obrigados a ser tributados os prédios urbanos. Teve também como propósito unir algumas incidências num só, portanto, tivemos agora um imposto mais robusto, que tributava, ou que tributa não só a detenção da propriedade, mas também a renda, tributa também a transmissão, seja ela onerosa ou gratuita. Portanto, temos um imposto aqui com uma multifacetado, não é, do ponto de vista da incidência. Com o novo código também foi possível implementar alguns mecanismos para que houvesse mais relação ou interligação das diferentes estruturas governamentais, de forma a promover aqui o grande, tanto objetivo que era alargar a base tributária. Portanto, esta reforma não está terminada, como disse, ainda está em curso. Próximo slide, por favor. Entretanto, nós gostávamos também de apresentar no próximo slide como é que se dá aqui a relação das várias entidades em Angola. Nós temos várias entidades que fazem concessão da terra. Tanto esta concessão não é centralizada, a nível dos municípios também a concessão de terras, mas a relação entre a concessão e a comunicação para o órgão executor da política fiscal não se dá da melhor forma, de modos que este exemplo que vos trazemos, este gráfico, que seria o ideal, portanto, esse ciclo de concessão, depois de comunicação à autoridade, portanto, a Administração Geral Tributária, para que pudesse atualizar quem está na detenção do prédio, a fim de permitir a tributação, e depois o cidadão tivesse então a oportunidade de fazer outros atos, do ponto de vista mais jurídico, portanto, a definição da titularidade, não tem ocorrido desta forma, de modos que, no âmbito da transição dos prédios, de uma pessoa para outra, incluindo do Estado para um particular, ou mesmo entre particulares, a administração tributária não tem muitas das vezes visibilidade desses factos e não consegue tributá-los na medida em que eles ocorrem. E isso gera uma desatualização da nossa base fiscal. E também aqui mencionar que, a nível de cadastro predial, nós temos em Angola 3 tipos de cadastro. Temos o cadastro meramente físico, que faz a descrição e cujo órgão é um outro, portanto, é o Instituto de Cartografia de Angola, e que a preocupação é apenas mapear o país. Temos depois o cadastro fiscal, que é consumado ou perseguido pela Administração Geral Tributária, e por fim temos um cadastro do ponto de vista jurídico, cujo objetivo é legitimar a titularidade. Mas estes cadastros ainda não conversam, e portanto, exatamente porque a regulação da propriedade, o fluxo que os prédios percorrem, as entidades envolvidas não se comunicam de forma eficiente, de modo que esses cadastros também não se comunicam. Fruto desse desajustamento, nós trazemos aqui alguns dados. Por exemplo, é relevante percebermos que, do ponto de vista do cadastro, portanto, no slide seguinte, por favor, do ponto de vista do cadastro, o número de habitações existentes que foram contabilizadas no censo que aconteceu em 2014, este ponto, portanto, habitacional, muito precariamente se encontra inscrito na base fiscal da Administração Geral Tributária, representa apenas 4%, e, portanto, isto prejudica imenso a arrecadação. Dizer que a nossa arrecadação, como percebem, é central, portanto, nós temos o órgão que executa a política e a Administração Geral Tributária, apesar de termos uma receita local, como o exemplo do Ghana, da Tanzânia, e, portanto, foram aqui citados, a nossa receita também é local, mas quem persegue essa política, quem operacionaliza o imposto é a administração, portanto, é um órgão central. Mas, de qualquer maneira, como dizia, a nossa base fiscal de cadastro é muito diminuta, apenas representa 4% do universo de imóveis que temos no país, e isso também afeta, inclusive, o registro. Portanto, os cidadãos também têm poucas oportunidades de legitimar a sua propriedade. E isto faz com que a nossa situação, do ponto de vista da segurança, da titularidade da propriedade, também se veja prejudicada nesse sentido. Portanto, há uma fraca tributação da propriedade e também há uma fraca regularização do ponto de vista jurídico desta mesma propriedade. Entretanto, algumas medidas têm sido gizadas, têm sido pensadas e executadas, mas, entretanto, o cenário que temos ainda é bastante mau. No slide seguinte, apresentamos um gráfico, por favor, queiram exibi-lo, onde vemos, de facto, a grande distância que vai daquilo que existe, da propriedade, e daquilo que de facto está nas nossas bases, sejam as bases ligadas ao cadastro físico, sejam as bases ligadas ao cadastro fiscal e também ao cadastro do ponto de vista do registro. Portanto, a nossa reforma tem está assente em algumas políticas para, de facto, minimizar este constrangimento, de modo que consigamos vir a ter uma tributação ótima. O que se pensou inicialmente já foi alcançado com o novo Código de Imposto Predial, foi a redução das taxas. Nós tínhamos taxas antes de 2011 bastante elevadas e foram gradualmente sendo reduzidas. Hoje temos taxas variáveis, mas tanto variáveis entre 0,1% a 2%, portanto não temos uma tributação alta e ao mesmo tempo temos medidas que servem para alargar a base. Portanto, é um imposto que não se quer onerar o cidadão e isto, de alguma forma, vai permitir que haja mais incentivo para a tributação. Entretanto, outras medidas que também temos estado a perseguir é a digitalização do imposto, torná-lo menos burocrático, menos papéis e que seja mais eficiente. Nós temos, por exemplo, várias formas melhor para pagar o imposto, temos vários recursos e isso também aproxima o cidadão do cumprimento desta obrigação. Também se está a pensar na possibilidade de dar conforto aos cidadãos que cumprem com as suas obrigações e que, em última instância, querem promover o seu registro através das janelas únicas. Eles podem, no momento da concessão, praticarem outros atos, darem a conhecer. Portanto, a janela única, na verdade, vai interligar várias entidades que intervêm neste processo, desde a entidade que concede, a entidade que tributa e a entidade que registra. E o cidadão tem o benefício de, numa janela, portanto, num único guichê, num único momento, cumprir com as suas obrigações de forma confortável, de forma eficiente. Portanto, essas janelas vão ser implementadas, estão previstas como ações que devem ocorrer com caráter urgente. Por outro lado, também há, como políticas, a necessidade de interligar as diferentes bases das diferentes estruturas que estão envolvidas na regularização, sejam aquelas estruturas ou as entidades que concedem a terra, a entidade, tanto a Administração Geral Tributária e também as conservatórias. Este trabalho também está em curso, porque, na verdade, essas bases hoje não conversam, como se disse, e há necessidade de que elas estejam assentes num único canal, portanto, que a informação transite facilmente. Isso vai garantir com que a base cadastral nacional esteja sempre atualizada para os diferentes interesses. Portanto, nós temos aqui ações muito concretas a nível da massificação do registro, para além de todas as campanhas que se fazem para melhorar ou para elevar a cultura ou a cidadania fiscal, também temos vindo a articular esforços com estas outras entidades para que o cadastro dê de forma massiva. Simplificamos ao máximo, não se cobra formulários, temos como fazer ou submeter um cadastro para efeitos fiscais por vias eletrónicas. Neste momento, por exemplo, de pandemia, conseguimos de alguma forma inscrever prédios na matriz fiscal, fruto destes meios alternativos e que, em princípio, veio mesmo para se manter. Por outro lado, a nível da entidade que regulariza, tanto do ponto de vista da titularidade.
Sorry, Carla, just to highlight, you have 1 minute left, please. Thank you.
Exatamente. Temos vindo a reduzir também as taxas ligadas aqui ao registro, para incentivar também os contribuintes. Portanto, a nossa receita tem vindo a crescer, pois ela representa cerca de 2,38% da receita não petrolífera do país. A título de conclusão, devo dizer que a medida de alargar a base tributária, né, com o novo código, tem resultado efetivo, pois antes não tínhamos tributação da propriedade rústica, o que era muito prejudicial para o país. Portanto, hoje também se pretende que a administração seja cada vez mais próxima do contribuinte, que garanta informação clara para que o contribuinte tenha mais oportunidades de cumprir com as suas obrigações e que essa fiscalização se dê de forma sistémica, por meio tanto da relação inter-entidades, não é? Desta intergovernamentalidade do Estado, de modos que a administração se antecipe a alguns factos. Os contribuintes, pela clareza do imposto e a sua simplicidade, tenham mais condições de cumprir com as suas obrigações. Muito obrigada.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carla, right on time. Sorry. Thank you very much. Obrigada. So now we will be moving from Angola to Kenya with our last presenter, Monica. Are you with us? Perfect. So Monica Wongo will be presenting the case study from Kenya. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to learn from the different presenters who've come before me. And it's amazing how common the problems we face as African countries are similar. I'm going to talk about the Kenyan experience in terms of strengthening intergovernmental cooperation for effective property tax in Kenya. In Kenya, basically the determination and governance of tax. Sorry,
Monica, just to make sure that you did choose English as your channel so that our interpreters can do the translation. Thank you so much. Make sure you choose English. Thank you.
Okay. I hope now I'm speaking in English. They can hear me in English, right?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk about the Kenyan experience in property tax, the collaboration between the central government and the local government, the county governments. In Kenya, the determination and governance of tax is actually based on different pieces of legislation. The central government basically does the stamp duty, which is a tax charged upon transfer of property from one owner to the next. And it's normally at a certain percentage based on the market value, which is determined by the government valuer. Another form of property tax that's determined and governed by central government in Kenya is the land rent on leasehold properties. And the amounts paid are also based on approved land users. For example, we have the residential users, the commercial users, and the industrial users. So the land rent is actually pegged on that. The rates, however, are decentralized. Land rates are charged by the different county governments, and we have 47 counties in Kenya. But even as the county governments determine the rates payable by landowners, they are guided by policy from the central government. The next slide, please. So the two institutions that are key in property taxation in Kenya, as I mentioned before, is the central government and the local government. In the central government, we have different government ministries. So in Kenya, we have the Ministry of Lands and Physical Planning, which is also responsible for land titling, supervision of cadastral plans, and property valuation. In addition to this function, the Ministry of Lands actually offers policy support to county governments in matters of land administration. The ministry, as I said before, determines stamp duty, and this is normally levied at a rate of 4% or 2% of the market value of the property. And this market value is actually determined by government valuers. When a proprietor or an owner of property wants to transfer their property, it is brought to the Ministry of Lands and Physical Planning for valuation so that the government can get the proper revenue due to them. And the county governments, they are semi-autonomous, and they can either subcontract the valuation for determination of land rates or ask the central government to assist in the determination of these rates. But whatever they do has to be approved by the central government before it is implemented by the county governments. The next slide, please. Property taxation is actually governed by pieces of legislation. One of these being the Valuers Act, which licenses and registers valuers with the responsibility of determining these taxes. And most of these pieces of legislation have actually not been revised or reviewed for a very long time. So we have the Valuation for Rating Act and the Rating Act, which guides the county governments or the decentralized governments in the valuation and determination of the rates that are paid on land. Then the Stamp Duty Act, which is Cap 48 of the laws of Kenya, provides the method and the amounts to be levied on buyers of land and real estate upon transfer of property. We have a Land Registration Act, which provides for the determination and collection of ground rent for the leasehold properties. Next slide, please. So a good tax system should actually meet 5 basic conditions: the fairness, the adequacy, simplicity, transparency, and administrative of ease. So there being a lack of cooperation between central and county governments in Kenya, we find every county does their own thing. Every decentralized government does what they feel fit in terms of calculation of rates and management of these taxes. So even among, even like for a case of Nairobi, which is the capital city, and the county government of Nairobi, we can find 2 properties next to each other with varied rates charged, because we don't have, up until now, we did not have a digital cadastre where you can lay it down and see the properties maybe with similar uses, similar sizes, which ideally should have actually the same rate in taxes or land rent. But we've had so many variations. Like in Nairobi, the revision for the land rates has not been done since 1981. So we are talking about 39 years where revisions have not been done and rates are still charged maybe at a higher percentage of a value that was determined almost 40 years ago. Then the lack of this coordination, we find a buyer of property taxes, they might need to get a land rent clearance certificate, which is obtained from the central government, and a land rates clearance certificate, which is from the county government. So the same landowner has to go to different institutions to collect these pieces of clearances in order to do the transfer of their properties. So this leads to long transaction times and obviously economic loss to the individual and also to the country. So now we have a land information system in both county and central government, but this for a long time has been in a manual format. We have recently come up with a digital land information system that will enable the county government and the central government to have like a common database. And this was launched by the President of the Republic of Kenya on the 27th of April, and it's commonly referred to as the RD-SASA. One of the components is a digital cadastre covering the whole country. This digital cadastre will make it easy to do like mass appraisals And the revisions in land rent that I say have been overdue for long will be possible with this digital cadastre. And the taxes will have, there'll be equity in taxation, both in county and central government. And the database that has been developed actually has linkages with all stakeholders, both in government and in the private sector. So one common set of, one database can actually be used for decision making, resulting in ease of doing business, which will obviously result in economic growth and development and investor confidence in Kenya. Next slide.
So
the Constitution of Kenya.
Sorry, Monica, just a reminder that you have 3 minutes left. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The Constitution of Kenya actually requires stakeholder engagement for any policy or change in management structure by central government that would affect operations of the county government and the general public. So there's been a lot of stakeholder engagement in the implementation of the National Land Information Management System to ensure that all leaders in the county governments are on board, and the change that is brought about by the county government is actually adopted by the change that is brought about by the central government is adopted by the county government, because unless we get a buy-in with the leaders, there'll be resistance to this change. And there's been resistance to change because it's easier for people to operate in a not easy as such, but the manual systems that are easy to manipulate and the corruption that comes with it actually makes it easier for people to prefer the manual versus the digital system. So in doing this stakeholder engagement, we are trying to get the user buy-in so that eventually this digital cadastre will actually be the basis for evaluation and for the governance of property taxation in Kenya. Next slide. So the benefits, I've talked about some before, is mass appraisal to determine land rates and rent to ensure efficient revenue collection, faster decision making, investor confidence, transparency and accountability in tax governance, and mapping of green spaces, government land, national monuments, roads, rails, and ensure infrastructural development. Next. Yeah, so basically that is my presentation today, and I'm open to take any questions that may be raised. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Thank you, Monica. So with this presentation, concludes our presentations today. Sorry, we will now move to the Q&A session. We will be taking your questions for the next 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you very much to everyone who submitted questions already. If you have any questions for Carla, please don't hesitate and add them, or Monica, please don't hesitate and add them to the chat. Otelke, if you don't mind, we'll start with you. We have a first question for you. You can join in with your camera on if you'd like. All our speakers are welcome to join in and turn their cameras and mics on. The first question to Otelke is, you used 3 municipalities in Dar es Salaam as an example. Has there been any variation between rural and urban areas with regards to centralization and decentralization? So over to you, Otelke.
Thank you so much. The first phase of the centralization, 2008 to 2016, that was only introduced in Dar es Salaam, in the then 3 municipalities. Now 2 of them have been split, so today it's 5 municipalities in Dar es Salaam. So that was introduced on a pilot basis to generate experiences, and thereafter the plan was to roll it out all over the country. So what's happened thereafter was it was decentralized. in the first instance. So the data we have for that period is only valid for Dar es Salaam or the 3 municipalities there. But then when it comes to the second phase of decentralization, from 2016 until now, then the property tax regime under the Tanzania Revenue Authority was rolled out all over the country. It has been very difficult to get data, except from that we know that there has been a major drop in revenues from property tax after the centralization in 2016. But I can say that the bulk of the revenues from property taxes, both before and after centralization, has come from the main municipalities, the cities, Dar es Salaam, Arusha, Mwanza, Mbeya, and so on. Very little revenues are collected in the more rural areas where you have the small townships. But data is a challenge. Fortunately, we have very good connections in Dar es Salaam, which has helped us to generate data. The same applies to Arusha. So what will happen now when TANESCO takes over? Well, that is another question. So maybe I'll stop there. Or shall I do the TANESCO question also?
We have some more questions for you as well, but if you want to go on with your explanation, don't worry about it. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. There are at least I noted two more questions. One is related to the political considerations, which certainly is an important factor about all these changes in the property tax regime. And this is something we have also addressed in some of our publications, that in particular in 2016, when property taxes was centralized fully, after 2 years where it had been under the municipalities, and the municipalities actually seemed to deliver. They generated substantial revenue, things seems to be working. So it came as a surprise, both on the municipalities and also us doing research on property tax in Tanzania, that the government decided to centralize. And the argument which was used or is reflected by the government and reflected in the budget speech in 2016, they are actually not reflecting the reality. That municipalities has managed to generate a substantial increase in revenues during those 2 years compared to previous years. So the political argument behind it is probably that the then government, the former President Magufuli, he was very much in focusing on centralization and so on, and we also know that the main municipalities and urban center were run by the opposite. They were managed and they were in the control of opposition. So by taking away one of the main revenue sources from the opposition-led municipalities, then one also to some extent eroded the power, undermined the power of opposition-led municipalities. This is something which we have seen in other countries, but it's very hard to get hard facts on this. But it's reasonable to assume that that is a part of the story behind the centralization of property taxes in 2016 in Tanzania. So politics, definitely it matter, but
Wonderful.
also
Thank you very much. We are still receiving some more questions for you. Some of them are on the electricity company and the collaboration with the national government. But before getting back to you, maybe we will make sure everyone has a first round of questions. So we will move to you, Faria and Frank. Faria and Frank, the first question you received is, what challenges do you foresee regarding the temporary valuation? And relatedly, could private sector-led valuation become an effective middle ground on property tax administration? Over to you.
I can take that. So
thank you.
The second question, sorry, the first one, I'm just like.
No worries, I'm happy to read it again. So what challenges do you foresee regarding the temporary valuations?
Mm-hmm.
And and relatedly, could private sector-led valuations become an effective middle ground on property tax administration?
So I mean, it's unconstitutional is the big problem. If you read both the Local Government Act of 1992 and the Local Governance Act of 2016, it's there in black and white. Land Valuation Division is the only authority within Ghana that has the power and the mandate to set valuation rates or and value properties. So I think, you know, you can say it's temporary, but at one point, you know, there could be a challenge. And of course, you know, one of the issues is that because no ministry has a clear mandate, it intensifies the intragovernmental conflict. You know, I think if they wanted to, they could take these assemblies to court. They're you know, that legal mismatch, I think, is just a problem, and and you have to rely on political will to overcome it at the moment, which is coming directly from donors. So the big VNG project and the Dutch project, you know, it's no surprise that, for example, the Deputy Minister of Finance sits on the board, right? And that's where that's coming from. So it's a great way to highlight how this mismatch and these like conflicts are happening. On private valuation, maybe I can ask Frank to answer that question. Frank, are you with us?
If not, we have more questions for you that we can get back to.
Yes. But I mean, I can quickly say on private value, again, if they can make it so that constitutionally it's not just LVD, Land Valuation Division, that does that, but is regulating it. So it can set some pricing and some guidelines as to how to do it. I think there can be scope. I think the thing, you know, and this is me personally as a statist, if you will, I think, you know, if you give the private sector an inch, they might take a mile. So it needs to be carefully done, I would say. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ria. So now we will move to a question for Carla. The question is, it's actually two questions. How can you assess collaboration between the different government agencies involved in property tax reform in Angola? And is there any legal provision that aims to foster collaboration in order to effectively implement the property tax reform? I'm happy to repeat that if needed.
Sim, o nosso Código de Imposto Predial, portanto, vou começar a resposta pelo fim, de facto tem disposições que motivam, não é, a melhorar as relações entre os demais órgãos e a administração. Portanto, temos inserido no nosso código um dever de colaboração, de modos que, no âmbito da relação, da vida do prédio, desde a sua concessão, as diferentes transmissões que sofre, as infraestruturações que pode também sofrer, estão estes órgãos obrigados a dar informação à administração, ou seja, alimentar essa base fiscal, para que tenhamos uma descrição sempre atualizada, possamos avaliar realisticamente os prédios. Portanto, essa disposição já existe, mas, entretanto, é necessário torná-la operacional. E, para ser mais operacional, há necessidade de se reverem internamente as práticas dos diferentes órgãos. Nós recentemente aprovamos uma lei que visa desburocratizar, portanto, minimizar a burocracia dentro da administração. E isto vai fazer com que os órgãos olhem para si mesmos, vejam qual é o seu objetivo e se muitas das ações que praticam são convenientes para esse objetivo. E, de alguma forma, também, tanto essa legislação vem, tanto definir o escopo de cada um dos órgãos e isso fazer com que eles conversem mais minimizem burocracia e deem mais informação. E a outra ação, que também não está dentro do código, mas é uma política que o Estado está a perseguir, é unir o cadastro nacional. Portanto, desde o cadastro, do ponto de vista da fotografia, cuja competência é o Instituto tanto Geodésico e Cartográfico de Angola, IGCA, e também a base fiscal, que deve se alimentar deste cadastro nacional, e, por fim, também a base jurídica, né, que, na verdade, titula os prédios. Desde o ponto de vista que haja harmonia dessas bases, que elas conversem, que se retroalimentem, nós teremos também um efeito positivo na nossa política fiscal. Como é que eu percebo hoje a atividade desses órgãos? Percebo um pouco melhor, porque apesar de não estarmos a fazer muito já, tanto tudo o que se quer, mas é uma problemática que já se discute nos diferentes órgãos. Temos tido muitas concertações e já temos mais legislação favorável a esta inter-relação. Obrigada.
Great, thank you so much, Carla. So going on with our round of questions, we are moving to Monica now. Monica, I hope you're still with us. So the question is in two parts. What were the challenges with implementing the National Land Information System? And though municipal and county entities were consulted, were they actively involved? And how did the difficult political and administrative relationships play out while the National Land Information System was being conceived? Happy to repeat that again if needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sukaya. I hope I said it right.
Right.
So the biggest problem was actually the data. It was hard to get like a complete set of data from the survey department, land registration department, and land administration department so that we consolidate all the information into one database. Right now, the National Land Information System has not been rolled out to other counties. Nairobi has been used as a pilot, and there's a lot of lessons we are still learning. And as we move forward, there'll be a lot of stakeholder engagement so that each county government is actually involved in the decision making regarding the type of data set that they want and the type of linkages between the central government and the county government, because we need data from them as well to build this cadastre into something that's useful to both the local and the central government. I don't know whether there's something else that I've missed out.
Sorry, no, that's actually perfect.
Okay, thank you.
We have one more question for you, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So the question is, I assume that other county governments have old valuation rules, same as Nairobi. Is this a capacity issue at the county level? Does the Ministry of Land undertake county valuations on behalf of the county?
Thank you so much. Most of our county governments actually have outdated valuation rules. The determination of the role, the values of the role is actually decentralized. So they can contract a private valuer to do it for them, but it has to be authenticated to see that they actually followed the right procedure in terms of the method of valuation and the equity in terms of the distribution of values over the parcels of land. So the central government will not do the valuation for them, but they will assist in policy guidance and to do quality control in the valuations that are presented for review and for use in the property tax management. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So moving back to Helge now. We have quite a few questions on the utility agency, so the institutional arrangements, legal and legal arrangements with regards to the collaboration between electricity agency and the municipality. Based on the data shared, can you forecast the effectiveness of the collaboration of the two? And yeah, what is your reading of the situation?
Thank you. Yeah, all interesting questions, but this is very new. It was proposed by the Minister of Finance in his budget speech on the 10th of June. So it's just 2.5 weeks ago, and it's now being discussed in the parliament, and there's a lot of also the municipalities and private sector are also involved in that discussion, because so there no technicalities have decided yet. The issue here is that the so-called property tax in this case will be paid when you, as a part of the payment when you buy electricity, and that implies that the tax will be imposed on both property owners and tenants. How can you distinguish between that? That's a challenge. Will it be flat rates or how? We really don't know. And how will TANESCO, the electricity supplier here, be compensated for this work? We don't know. The positive thing you can say is that if you can pay a tax or fee as a part of your payment of electricity, it will reduce both administrative and compliance costs. But there are all these other issues which you need to sort out related to distinguishing between property owners and tenants. To my knowledge, the only country, but maybe others have more insights into this, but to my knowledge, the only country which had tried this, similar, that the electricity provider collects property tax, it was Greece in 2011, and it lasted for 2 years before it was abolished. So it will be very interesting to follow Tanzania in this case, whether they will go for it or not, or whether they have to find other solution. I was very surprised when I read this in the budget speech, because I would have expected that, given the problems TRA had, it would make sense to re-decentralize property taxation to the municipalities based on a proper assessment of the experiences over the last decade. But that did not take place. Just a final comment. In South Africa, the law, as far as I understand it, says that if a property owner, whether it's public or private, is not paying property tax, then the municipality can go to the electricity supplier, Eskom in South Africa, and then cut off the electricity if they don't pay. And that happened, according to a colleague at the African Tax Institute some years ago, when the National Assembly in Cape Town had not paid the property tax to Cape Town City Council, and then Eskom came and cut off the electricity. So that may also give some incentives to pay property tax. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Helge. I think we will now move back to Feria. We have a question for you. In your presentation, you suggested to change the institutional foundations. This seems like a very ambitious goal. What are your recommendations and practical solutions to implement the recommendations you came up with, and therefore overcome the resistance of the central government?
Thank you. Is Frank, are you here? Maybe
yeah, I'm here.
If he's here, you can.
Yeah,
Frank,
can you repeat the question?
Would you want to answer this, please?
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, can you repeat some part of the question? I was missing because of Rebecca, but I believe that she was talking about certain implementation.
Okay. Yeah, so
the connection is coming and going for Frank.
Exactly.
I mean, I would say there are 3 key things, right? I mean, of course, changing the constitution is a tall order, but I think there are 3 key things that can be done. One is this issue of valuation, which is for it not to be a centralized function, for it to actually stay at the local level, For example, at the a function that's at the local level is town and country planning. So the maps, all this, town and country planners are empowered to do this function at the local level. The valuation department should be able to do this at the local level and not seek approval. The cadastral roles have to be approved by the center. To actually keep this local would open up the bottleneck. Two is the issue that Frank mentioned, which is around human resourcing. So the fact that officers can get transferred at a whim, mayors can be fired. It prevents this institutional knowledge building, the capacity to seed within local governments to be able to do this work of how to do property tax, how to administer property tax. And again, these decisions are made by the center. Actually, the human resource arm of local governments, the office of the head of the local government service secretariat, is a separate agency from the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development, which says something about the fragmentation at the center. And last but not least, and this is maybe the hardest thing to recommend or to figure out what might happen, is to actually have one ministry that has a mandate for oversight. Because right now, neither the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development, which are the key ministries you would want to put in charge, neither one has the mandate to override each other. And so you get these awkward clashes on policy and directives. So I would say those are the key things for that.
Great, thank you so much. So now we move on to a general question for everyone, if you don't mind. The question would be that a common theme across the presentations today is a lack of adequate data sharing between localities and the center, and also within each governmental entity. To what extent is this a technical or technological issue as opposed to a political one? And can you comment on why some agencies withhold data and which could be done, and what could be done to facilitate data sharing? Thank you so much. If you're willing to answer the question, please feel free to jump in.
Creio que centralizar o sistema, portanto, a tributação predial é uma opção naturalmente política, mas do ponto de vista da Receita, creio que foi unânime as situações cá apresentadas de que o imposto deve de facto ser um imposto local para permitir o desenvolvimento desses territórios, mas quanto à própria execução desta política fiscal, creio que não necessita necessariamente estar concentradas nos municípios. Por exemplo, no caso de Angola, os municípios têm autonomia, por exemplo, de tramitar, de colocar no mercado os lotes, as concessões, tanto as concessões dos lotes que vão tendo, não é? Fruto desse planeamento urbanístico. Portanto, tem um poder local aqui assente e a Receita também efetivamente local. Mas entretanto, a política fiscal ainda é centralizada e penso que não é uma má opção, mas desde que as receitas sejam alocadas aí onde a propriedade está. Portanto, isto vai permitir desenvolver estes territórios.
Thank you very much. I'd like to see with our other presenters if anyone has further comments. Otherwise, we can move on to the webinar outcomes. Monica, maybe? I don't want to put you on the spot, though.
I actually just saw a question that somebody had asked about the land value map. Will it cover all counties in Kenya? Yes, the Ministry of Lands and Physical Planning is coming up with a land value map, what we are terming as the National Land Value Index, but that's for a totally different purpose, is to assist with infrastructural valuations, because there's been like speculations when there's like the standard gauge railway or any other major infrastructure coming up, the people buy property for speculation. So we see values tending to increase around the corridor where infrastructure is about to come up. But the cadastre is not going to assign value for property taxation. The county governments will still be charged with the responsibility of doing the valuations and determining and governing and collecting property taxes in terms of rates. And in terms of land values, the national government will still do it. Will not have like a set map with values that stakeholders cannot deviate from. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. So I think this concludes our Q&A session. Thank you all for taking our attendees' questions. We will now move on to the webinar outcomes, which will be presented by my ATA colleague, Frank Alizinze, who is a program specialist at ATA. Frank, you have 7 to 8 minutes to wrap up this webinar. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Sukaina. And thank you so much to the presenters, the discussants, and most importantly, our attendees. So I'll present the summary of the webinar today on behalf of Dr. Nara Monkam, the Director of Research at the African Tax Administration Forum, who could not attend last minute due to some other unforeseen circumstances. So we are honored to have high-level delegates from the Mozambique Tax Administration, Zimbabwe Tax Authority, as well as other institutions. Thank you so much for honoring the invitation. And we have seen during the webinar that indeed property tax administration is usually tricky, mainly because of the fact that we have the central government and the local government in the fore. Now, we also saw that probably in most African countries, we find that the central government is responsible for the property valuation, while on the other hand, we have the local government that is responsible for rate setting, collection, etc. And therefore, there is a need indeed for collaboration between these two tiers of government for effective property taxation management. Now, based on this, we have heard several case studies on the lessons as well as possible solutions to this challenge. And we have heard from Tanzania, case studies from Ghana, Kenya, as well as Angola. Now, in the case of Tanzania, we had an interesting situation where property tax management kept on being pushed from one side to another. That is between the central government as well as the local government. And again, in terms of administration, we have seen it moving from the local government to the national tax collecting body, and again, now going to the power utility company. That's really an interesting situation. But then, of course, it was emphasized that the lack of intergovernmental consultations on these particular decisions have created some sort of distrust among these entities. And therefore, it was recommended that it is important that consultations are done among these entities before such decisions are made. And again, information need to be exchanged among these institutions. And again, clarification of division of functions is also imperative. And most importantly, we also heard that it is important that these entities are incentivized, deliberately incentivized to coordinate. And in the case of Ghana, we also heard that the collaboration between the central government and local government really remains a bit poor, in the sense that there are ambiguous rules. And we also heard that there are institutional fragmentations, which mainly emanate from the decentralization policy, as well as the poor exchange of information. And, you know, to counter or to deal with these challenges, we heard the experts proposing that it is important that they revise the institutional framework to give more autonomy to the local government, because property taxes are mainly for the local government and they are best administered there. So it's important to empower the local government to actually undertake the necessary functions. And we also heard that it is also, another option is actually to outsource some functions, for instance, property valuation. And then we moved on to hear from the case of Angola, where we heard that in Angola, again, we see the similar problem where several entities in the property tax administration do not talk to each other. And mainly this is because of the colonial system that was, of course, inherited, and this worsened the problem of lack of coordination among the entities. But then we have heard that new reforms, of course, are in place, which are also, of course, focusing on digitalization, mainly attempting to consolidate the tax base at the registration process, and hopefully this will actually reduce the problem of poor coordination among the entities. And lastly, we heard the case of Kenya, where mainly they're saying that they have launched the National Land Information System for effective property tax management. And the benefits of this particular system, of course, is transparency, efficient revenue collection, but most importantly, this is expected to actually foster quick and coordinated decision-making because it's like a centralized database. So we see the role of digitalization again in trying to ensure proper coordination among the entities. Now, finally, we can actually see that out of all these case studies, there are some 4 key elements that we can learn. In as far as collaboration between two entities are concerned in property tax management. Firstly, it is imperative to actually incentivize these the institutions or the entities that are handling property tax, taxation. And again, this will help in terms of exchange of information. So exchange of information is key. And again, we have also seen across that it is imperative to revise the archaic laws and institutional frameworks. And again, we have seen that it is important to have clarity in terms of the division of functions. And lastly, we have, of course, also heard that digitalization is an important aspect in as far as enhancing the collaboration between the local government and the central government is concerned. Having heard all those interesting and powerful recommendations, what's next? So, ladies and gentlemen, as you are aware, or you might be aware, this was the 3rd webinar in a series of 3 webinars that the African Property Tax Initiative under the ICTD, as well as the African Tax Research Network from ETAF, organized. And these 3 series of webinars were organized leading up to the 2021 ATRN Congress, which is expected to take place from the 6th to 8th September. And this Congress will be held, of course, in collaboration with Kenya Revenue Authority. But the most important thing out of these 3 series of webinars is a policy brief that will capture all the discussions that we have held and the key recommendations out of the 3 themes from these 3 series of webinars. So please be on the lookout for that particular policy brief, which will consolidate all these powerful recommendations. And just for information, the theme of the 2021 ATRN Congress is maximizing property tax revenues through digitalization. Of course, there was a call for papers, which expires in the next 2 days on the 2nd of July. So, of course, you can participate. Those that wrote papers will participate as authors, but we encourage you, of course, to also attend and even, be part of these discussions. In terms of the structure and the arrangement, the ATRN Congress usually takes place physically, but as we are all aware, COVID-19 has changed everything. So the plan was to have it in a hybrid format, but then, of course, discussions are still going on to actually have it in form of like a virtual format. So you will be communicated in terms of the final decision on this particular item. And just to give you a glimpse of the Congress will be in 3 days. The first day will be for policy dialogues. And this is where now we shall have an intersection of researchers and practitioners discussing some key issues in as far as property tax reforms are concerned. Day 2 will be for the prior research sessions, and these will be for the papers that have just been submitted. And the final day will be for validation and adoption of key strategies for property tax reforms in Africa. And this will be in form of a plenary. So please plan to attend and participate. Otherwise, thank you so much for your attendance. And we really enjoyed the discussions, and I hope you also did. And please be on the lookout for the policy brief and plan to attend the 2021 ATN Congress from the 6th to 8th September. Thank you so much, and have a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you.
Merci Franck, merci beaucoup. Un grand merci à tous d'avoir assisté à notre webinaire. Pour rappel, nos 3 webinaires émanant de cette série en collaboration avec la TAF sont disponibles sur notre chaîne YouTube. Par ailleurs, une autre politique résultante de cette discussion sera également publiée et vous sera communiquée. N'oubliez pas de vous inscrire, donc, comme expliqué, au congrès de l'ETRN en septembre, qui abordera des thématiques similaires. Un très grand merci à nos intervenants d'aujourd'hui, à nos interprètes sans qui nous n'aurions pas pu organiser cet événement aujourd'hui. Suivez-nous sur nos réseaux sociaux et abonnez-vous à nos infolettres. Au plaisir de vous revoir bientôt. Merci à tous et bonne journée.